On the 5th of March, 1953, the most feared man on earth lay dying on a couch in his dacha outside Moscow. He had been there since the previous night, collapsed, alone, soaked in his own urine, and not a single person in the building had dared open the door to check on him. Not his guards, not his doctors, not the most powerful men in the Soviet Union who stood in the corridor outside, listening, and did nothing. Because entering that room without permission was the kind of decision that could get you shot. And Joseph Stalin had made sure of that. He had spent 30 years engineering a world in which no one acted without his approval. And now, that system was killing him. He lay there for 11 hours before anyone went in. Think about what that means. This was a man who had ordered the deaths of roughly 20 million people, who had dismantled armies, collapsed governments, and redrawn the map of half the world. He had made grown men confess to crimes they never committed just to earn a bullet rather than more time in his presence. And at the end, he was completely alone. Not because his enemies had finally won, but because his own system had made it too dangerous for anyone to save him. That is the story of Joseph Stalin, and almost none of it works the way you think it does. The gray blur, here is something nobody tells you about the October Revolution of 1917. The man who would eventually own it wasn't even in the room when it mattered most. While Lenin was thundering from balconies, and Trotsky was commanding the Military Revolutionary Committee that physically seized Petrograd, Joseph Stalin was editing a party newspaper. He attended meetings, he took notes, he filed paperwork. He was so peripheral to the revolution's dramatic center that the early Soviet encyclopedias gave him barely a paragraph. Leon Trotsky, brilliant, magnetic, the man who had organized the actual seizure of power, called Stalin a mediocrity to his face and in print. He wasn't being cruel, he was being accurate, or so everyone around him believed. That belief would cost Trotsky everything. In April 1922, the Bolshevik Party created a new administrative position, General Secretary. It sounded important, but wasn't, or so the brilliant men thought. Managing appointments, shuffling personnel files, overseeing communications. Grunt work, beneath the dignity of men like Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Bukharin. So they let someone else have it. Stalin took the job without argument, and within 7 years, he owned the party completely. What nobody understood in April 1922 was that controlling appointments meant controlling everything. Every regional party secretary, every local committee chairman, every mid-level functionary across the largest country on earth answered to the General Secretary's office. Stalin spent the next 3 years quietly filling those positions with people loyal specifically to him. Not to the revolution, not to Lenin, to Stalin. Lenin saw it, too late, but he saw it. In December 1922, dictating from a sickbed after his first stroke, Lenin wrote what historians now call his testament, explicit and damning. Stalin had concentrated enormous power and lacked the caution to wield it responsibly. Lenin's recommendation: remove him from the General Secretary position entirely. On the 23rd of April 1923, that testament was read aloud at the Central Committee plenum. Stalin sat in the room and listened to Lenin's own words call for his removal. The party voted to suppress the document. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who would both be dead within 13 years, argued that Stalin had learned his lesson and deserved another chance. The testament was buried. Stalin thanked the committee and went back to his office. What followed between 1923 and 1929 was one of the most methodical political dismantlements in history. Stalin allied with Zinoviev and Kamenev to isolate Trotsky. By January 1925, Trotsky had been stripped of his military command. Then Stalin turned on Zinoviev and Kamenev, partnering with Bukharin to destroy them. By October 1926, both men had been expelled from the Politburo. Then, Stalin destroyed Bukharin. On the 18th of January, 1929, Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union entirely. He wandered through Turkey, France, Norway, and finally Mexico, where on the 20th of August 1940, a Soviet agent named Ramon Mercader drove an ice axe into the back of his skull in Coyoacan. Stalin never raised his voice through any of it. He never needed to. As Robert Service put it in his definitive biography, Stalin understood something his rivals never grasped. In a bureaucratic state, whoever controls the files controls the future. Every other dictator in history needed to be the loudest voice in the room. Stalin only needed to be the last one. The Great Terror, on the 1st of December 1934, a man named Leonid Nikolaev walked into the Smolny Institute in Leningrad and shot Sergei Kirov in the back of the head. Kirov was not just any Soviet official. He was the head of the Leningrad Party, one of the most genuinely popular figures in the entire Soviet leadership, and, by most accounts, Stalin's closest political friend. The two men had vacationed together, hunted together. Stalin called him Moronic, an affectionate nickname reserved for people he actually trusted. Whether Stalin ordered the assassination has been debated by historians including J. Archgetty and Oleg Klevniak for decades. No definitive proof has ever surfaced in either direction. But what Stalin did with the murder is not debated at all. What followed over the next 4 years would become the most psychologically bewildering episode in the history of modern dictatorship. Between 1936 and 1938, Stalin executed approximately 750,000 people in 22 months. But here's the detail that separates this from every other purge in history. These were not his enemies. They were his allies, the original Bolsheviks, the men who had stood alongside Lenin in 1917, the men who had built the Soviet state from nothing with their own hands. Zinoviev and Kamenev, founding members of the Politburo, were executed on August 25, 1936, after publicly confessing to crimes virtually no serious historian believes they committed. They confessed because months of NKVD interrogation had broken them, and because Stalin had personally promised that cooperation meant survival. It didn't. He lied. Then came Nikolai Bukharin. Lenin himself had called Bukharin the favorite of the whole party in that same 1922 testament. Bukharin was a genuine intellectual and economist who had known Stalin personally for over 20 years. In his final weeks, he wrote desperate letters, not to the general secretary but to Joseph, his friend. On the 15th of March 1938, Bukharin was shot in the basement of Lubyanka prison. The letters were found in Stalin's personal archive after his death. He had kept every one of them. And then Stalin turned on his own military. Between May 1937 and September 1938, 3 of 5 Soviet marshals were executed. 13 of 15 army commanders were eliminated. 8 of 9 admirals were killed. On the eve of the most destructive war in human history, Stalin had essentially decapitated the Red Army. The question historians have never fully resolved is why. These men had already surrendered, already confessed, already proven they posed no threat. The answer, when you sit with it long enough, is deeply uncomfortable. Stalin wasn't afraid of what these men might do. He was afraid of what they knew. Anyone who had known him before the legend existed was a living reminder that the legend was invented. He didn't purge his enemies, he purged his witnesses. And if you think that level of paranoia should have destroyed him, what came next very nearly did. The war he should not have survived. At 3:15 in the morning on the 22nd of June, 1941, the largest military invasion in human history began. 3.8 million Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory simultaneously along a 2,900-kilometer front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Over 3,000 tanks, 2,700 aircraft. The German operation had a name, Barbarossa, and it had a goal: destroy the Soviet Union before winter. Stalin had been warned it was coming. British intelligence had passed him specific dates. His own spy network had passed him troop movements. As recently as June 14, 1941, TASS, the Soviet state news agency, had published an official denial that any German threat existed, a denial Stalin himself had ordered. He had refused to believe any of it. In the first 72 hours of Barbarossa, entire Soviet armies were encircled before they could retreat. 22 divisions destroyed in the opening days. By the end of June, Germany had captured more Soviet territory than the size of France, and Joseph Stalin had disappeared. Between the 22nd of June and the 28th of June 1941, Stalin essentially vanished from the Kremlin. According to Simon Sebag Montefiore, who accessed previously unavailable Soviet archives, Stalin retreated to his dacha at Kuntsevo for 6 days. Stopped taking calls, stopped issuing orders. The man who had micromanaged every arrest, every appointment, every production quota for 2 decades went completely silent. 2. On the 29th of June, a delegation from the Politburo drove out to Kuntsevo. Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, Mikoyan, the most powerful men in the Soviet Union, pulling up to a dacha to check on one man. When they walked in, Stalin looked at them and said 4 words. "Why have you come?" Montefiore argues those 4 words weren't a greeting, they were an admission. Stalin, who had spent 30 years making unauthorized gatherings of senior officials potentially treasonous, believed in that moment that they had come to arrest him. They had not. They couldn't. The system he had built had made them incapable of acting without his permission. Even now, even with the country burning, they needed him to tell them what to do. That failure of nerve by the men in that room changed the entire 20th century. By July 3, 1941, 11 days after the invasion, Stalin was back at his desk and on Soviet radio, calling citizens brothers and sisters, speaking quietly, personally, almost vulnerably, in a register nobody had ever heard from him. Not because it was brilliant, but because a Soviet Union without Stalin at its center was something nobody inside the system knew how to imagine. What followed still puzzles military historians. Stalin gave Zhukov and Vasilevsky's genuine operational freedom, something he had previously denied every commander alive. On the 7th of November 1941, with German forces positioned just 15 kilometers from Red Square, Stalin ordered a military parade through Moscow. Troops marched past Lenin's tomb and went directly to the front. By the 8th of May 1945, 27 million Soviet citizens were dead, and Stalin's grip on power was tighter than the day the war began. The death nobody planned for. On the 13th of January 1953, Soviet state media published an announcement that sent a specific kind of terror through the highest levels of the Kremlin. 9 doctors arrested, 6 of them Jewish, accused of murdering Soviet leaders through deliberate medical negligence and plotting to kill military commanders. The doctors' plot, the state called it. Fabricated from beginning to end, every serious historian who has examined the case, including Amy Knight in her study of the Soviet secret police, has reached the same conclusion. This was not about doctors. Lavrenti Beria understood it. Molotov understood it. Khrushchev understood it. The doctors' plot wasn't about doctors. It was the opening move of a new purge, and this time the targets were old Bolsheviks or generals. They were sitting in the Politburo. Men who had survived every previous wave of terror by making themselves indispensable now had reason to believe their names were already on a list. Stalin was 73 years old, increasingly paranoid, and had just signaled that nobody around him was safe. Then, on the night of the 28th of February, 1953, Stalin hosted a private dinner at Kuntsevo dacha. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Boldunin attended. The dinner ran until approximately 4 in the morning of March 1st. The 4 men left. Stalin retired to his private quarters. He never came out. Through the entire daylight hours of March 1st, Stalin's guards waited outside his door. Lights unchanged since morning. No movement, no call bell, no sound, and nobody entered. Because entering Stalin's private quarters without being summoned was the kind of decision that could end your life. 30 years of rule had made that abundantly clear. So they waited. At approximately 10:00 in the evening of March 1st, a guard named Peter Lozgachev finally opened the door. Stalin was on the floor. He had suffered a massive stroke sometime the previous night. He was conscious, but unable to speak, lying in his own urine on the carpet of his study. He had been there for merely 18 hours. The doctors called to treat Stalin arrived terrified. The doctors' plot had made treating him the most politically dangerous act in the Soviet Union. Every physician in that room knew the same thing. If he died under their care, they would almost certainly be shot. For 4 days, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Boldunin rotated through the bedside vigil, watching, waiting. According to Montefiore's first-hand accounts, Beria alternated between visible distress and barely concealed relief, dropping to his knees when Stalin rallied and straightening up coldly when he declined again. On the 5th of March, 1953, at 9:50 in the evening, Joseph Stalin died. Beria walked out of the room and within minutes was overheard telling someone he had saved everyone. Within days, the doctor's plot charges were quietly dropped. What followed the announcement of Stalin's death was something nobody inside the Kremlin had fully anticipated. Across the Soviet Union, people wept in the streets, genuinely. In Moscow, the crowds surging toward his lying in state in the Hall of Columns were so dense that hundreds of people were crushed to death. The man who had ordered the deaths of roughly 20 million of his own citizens died in his bed, untouched, mourned by millions. No dictator in the 20th century managed that combination. Not one. The legacy that outlived everything On the 25th of February 1956, Nikita Khrushchev stood before the 20th Party Congress in Moscow and again reading from a document that nobody in that room had been warned is coming. For 4 hours, he described Stalin's crimes in clinical, specific, devastating detail. The fabricated confessions, the executed marshals, the paranoia that had guttered the Red Army before the worst war in human history, the cult of personality built on deliberate falsification. Delegates who had spent 20 years worshiping that name reportedly fainted in their seats. Several reportedly suffered heart attacks before Khrushchev finished reading. The speech was supposed to begin de-Stalinization. It was supposed to dismantle the machine. It didn't. It removed the name from the buildings and the statues from the squares. But the architecture underneath, the surveillance, the institutional paranoia, the culture of absolute deference to centralized power, that survived completely intact. The Soviet Union ran on Stalinist infrastructure for 38 more years after the man himself was dead. And the numbers underneath that legacy have never stopped being argued. Between 1928 and 1945, the Soviet Union transformed from a largely agrarian economy into the world's second industrial power. Robert Conquest, the historian who documented the Gulag system more rigorously than almost anyone, acknowledged that transformation, while also calculating that the collectivization famine of 1932 and 1933 alone killed somewhere between 6 and 20 million people. The industrialization was real. So was the cost. Historians have spent decades arguing whether one justifies the other, and they have not reached a verdict. Stalin's own family couldn't escape the argument either. His daughter, Svetlana Alilieva, defected to the United States on the 6th of March, 1967, exactly 14 years and 1 day after her father's death. She returned to the Soviet Union in 1984, then left again. She died in Wisconsin on the 22nd of November, 2011, having spent 44 years running from a name she had been born into and could never put down. His grandson, Alexander Bergansky, became a theater director in Moscow and refused publicly for decades to discuss his grandfather at all. In 2013, he gave a single interview. He said the family had lived under a curse. In 2021, the Levada Center, Russia's most respected independent polling organization, found that 56% of Russians viewed Stalin positively, the highest figure recorded since polling began. Not despite the deaths, alongside them. Which brings everything back to the question this script opened with. Hitler's regime was designed to die with its mission. It lasted 12 years and collapsed in 8 days after he pulled the trigger. Stalin's regime was designed to outlast him. It lasted 38 years beyond his death and shaped every Cold War crisis the world navigated in between. So here is the question historians are still genuinely arguing in 2025. If a regime built around a mission ends in ruins the moment its leader dies, and a regime built for survival produces nearly 4 more decades of repression after its architect is gone, which one actually caused more suffering in the long run? Leave your answer in the comments. Thanks for watching WW2 Recall. If you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into the men who shaped the 20th century's darkest chapters. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.